It just reduces us to our skin colour and our ethnicity. Very unhelpful.
It's not suggesting for 1 minute that a contemporary black person can immediately know what the experience of slavery is, but just that they feel the echo of history more deeply. A bit like, as a woman, I might have a better understanding of what it was like to miscarry and hemorrhage in medieval times than a man.
I'm going to move on to reparations because it's a subject I think both of you have probably got strong opinions on. And today, Number 10 said that reparations are not on the agenda. This is ahead of a major Commonwealth summit beginning next week. A spokesperson added that the government's position has not changed and that we do not pay reparations. However, all three candidates looking to become the Commonwealth's next Secretary General have signalled their support for reparations, piling pressure on the UK government. Claire Fox, can Number 10, can Keir Starmer bat this away to one side with such ease? Is it a conversation that we'll keep having? And what do you think the answer might be?
So I think it's a conversation that's going to keep coming up, but for all the most regressive reasons, which is that, sadly, I feel that the identity politics has got us into such a mess. People feel that the only way that they can move forward today is by trying to demand that the harms of the past are done away with or diminished. And I don't think that it's helped that Keir Starmer then starts removing portraits from Number 10 of people he thinks were associated with slavery, like Gladstone, for example. Great insult to Gladstone. But, those kind of gesture politics just fuel this mood. I mean, I always really liked that Frantz Fanon quote. I mean, he's a big anti-colonial activist, and he said, "I'm not a prisoner of history. I should not seek there for my destiny." And I think that's absolutely right. There is something wrong with today's anti-racism, that it's kind of given up on seeing the future and constantly looks to the past as a way of supposedly righting wrongs. And I just think it trashes history. It's incredible. Where would it end? I mean, I could now sit here and say everything that's happened to me is as a consequence of the Irish potato famine. And I demand that the government give me and my family, and so on and so forth. It completely removes agency. It's a kind of defeatist position. And it sees oneself in the present as somehow the victim of the past all the time. So it's that kind of politicization of the past needs to be confronted. The problem is that this Labour government has played along with a lot of those identity politics memes and nods through to them and then says, no, we're not going to pay any money. So obviously that's then going to jar. They need to confront it head on and say it's the wrong way to approach problems of contemporary people's. If there's a problem of racism today, we need to deal with it, not think that it's all to do with slavery from the past.
Tessa Dunlop, is Claire Fox right to cite the Irish potato famine as a similar level of a sort of similar issue, similar level of harm to people from Caribbean nations, let's just say, being bought and sold as slaves? Is that a good comparison to make?
I don't find it hugely helpful. I think one of the reasons is that slavery, which involved, top state British institutions, the Royal African Company early on under Charles II, have their fingerprints all over the slavery story. And on the one hand, you could say, oh, well, these are Charles's ancestors. In fact, they're not. There's 15 monarchs between him and then, and he's a Hanoverian and they were Stuarts. So you get very lost trying to sort of pin it on royalty. But we can pin it on, for example, the institution of monarchy, which is still our head of state and which is a hugely rich institution. And I think, well, it's clear. I mean, British government aren't even cranking up their foreign aid budget to what it was when it was first introduced by Gordon Brown. So if they had any intention of giving money away to less developed countries, which is effectively what the Caribbean and parts of Africa are, then surely, arguably, you'd do it through those channels first. They ain't going to be giving anybody any money. David Lammy's got his knickers in a twist, but he can shrug and say, well, I'm in power now. So, what I said before, I was speaking personally. I think the key is, sorry, you go.
Well, he said when he was a backbench Labour MP, he called for reparations, didn't he, in the wake of the Windrush scandal?
He did. But I think, they're just men in suits now. That sort of, slightly pointless middle ground power push. I think where we could win some goodwill, and our royal family certainly could, Charles about, of course, to start on this big tour in Australia, as well as meeting all the heads of the Commonwealth, is by properly funding some research. Academia is always stuffed financially, and there's great organizations like CARICOM that would welcome the royal family taking the lead here and allowing the impacted communities at the table and getting in, forensic accountants, leading academics to actually really work out what this story is, where full culpability sits. I'm not saying there should necessarily be a price tag on it, but to just get it out in the open, to perhaps have an exhibition surrounding it, but definitely for it to be funded by the royal family.
Yeah, I mean, look, academics and lawyers have already looked at the overall bill owed by Britain. They say for its part in the slave trade could be worth anything between £206 billion and 19 trillion. The Prime Minister of Barbados alone has said that slave-owning nations owed her country £3.9 trillion. I mean, it gets to the point, Claire Fox, where these conversations become ridiculous more than useful when you're talking about that amount of money, but also that the Prime Minister of a country is still sort of haggling for it. Is that the best use of her time? Is there a better way for her to put this argument across for more support for her country through trade deals or something that isn't, well, I'll take that bag of cash, thank you very much, and I'm looking for 3.9 trillion across all of you, 9 slave-owning countries?
Well, who are we trying to hold to account for what? I mean, my point of the analogy with the Irish potato famine was not to say I really suffered as much as slaves, by the way. It was to say that once you start going down the victim road, and it's actually what I'm more concerned about is that people see this as active anti-racism today, or even when we were talking about developing countries. If the only way that developing countries can see themselves as progressing is to demand reparation for the past, that's actually
That's a sorry indictment, isn't it?
It's also a very passive way of viewing things. I mean, it's like, no, they are not slaves today. They are now independent countries. And obviously you could get into this in relation to colonialism and anti-colonialism, all of these terrible things of the past. Slavery was an absolute abomination. I completely disagree with those people who say, oh, well, we should be congratulated as the British for freeing the slaves. That's not my point. My point is that we should learn from the past. I mean, Tessa says, oh, well, let's have more money to go into academia. I mean, there's an awful lot of academic work being done on slavery. There's an awful lot of academic work being done on slavery at the expense of a lot of other issues that we could invest in. I'm never opposed to knowing more, but there is a political obsession with the slavery issue as though it affects people today in the here and now, which it does not. And so consequently, who are you holding account for what sins? I mean, if people in this country are to be held responsible either for slavery or colonialism in 2024, that implies that there's a direct line that we are all related or responsible, some kind of collective guilt for things that happened in the past. And I just disagree with that. I think that you could have an argument about, for example, whether we have more foreign aid, but I think it should be made in the terms of today. And there's an argument about whether that's a positive thing or not. What we could do with doing is helping and investing in and encouraging development in the developing world. But guess what? The fashionable new neo-colonialism of 2024 is a kind of green environmentalism that says don't develop and make all the sins that we make the mistakes that we made, and telling people not to develop at all. Whereas I want modern industrial societies to develop all over the place so that people can be their own agents today. And so this harping back to the past, which is a politicization, and that happens at universities all the time. People will say, I can't walk past that statue because I feel personally wounded because that was a slave owner, and so on and so forth. That's what I'm saying actually makes a mockery of the horrors of slavery.
Well,
from our very uber white perspective, let's own this. We're on the radio. All three of us are bright white, sitting here in our respective privileged position. I think it's hard, therefore, to condemn or to criticize what people may feel when they walk past a statue if we have not got their lived experience. You can poo-poo that, but I think it's clearly a very different experience living in this country
Well, it's
and
also
coming to
a
this country.
statue is a celebration or a historical marking of a person, whereas asking for money and reparations all these decades later surely is a different argument. I don't know, Tessa.
And also, while there's this idea that huge amounts of money has gone into the research of slave trade, actually the fact that Kate could only give this extraordinarily broad ballpark of what might be owed is indicative of the lack of thorough investigative research, because it's not been properly funded. And I think that that's where the Crown could step in. They could host a summit. Arguably, this would buy them eons of time, because nothing in academia moves fast. It gives them bundles of goodwill, and it looks like they're moving forwards and actually taking the initiative. And the one thing that King Charles isn't short of is a bob or two, because he owns all the offshore wind
But he's
farms.
never going to have enough, though, is he, to
he
basically compensate?
The way in which the sovereign grant is rigged meant that he was able to sort of throw back into the great British coffers huge amounts of money this last year, because he's done so well. So arguably, yeah, he could afford something like that. And I think it would buy him goodwill. Let's not forget, he made sure, his mother made sure, he was just sort of shoehorned in as the head of the Commonwealth. Even that was pretty entitled and undemocratic. And I would hope that William resists an equivalent move when it's his turn.
Someone's message in here, Susie, says lots of tribal leaders in West Africa were seriously involved in slavery and earned millions trading their own people. And look at some of those countries now with their own slavery problems. Complicated, no, says Susie G. Just putting that perspective across. Final word to you, Claire Fox.
Well, I just think that people, I actually thought that what Tessa said was quite cynical. You know, you could buy goodwill, you could buy time. I mean, these things actually, people start using these apologies and these gestures to gain in their own moral authority. But when it comes to lived experience, students at Oxford University, when they walk past a statue, the idea that I can't know, they can't know what it was like to be a slave either. And to diminish people and reduce them to their skin colour is the kind of racialising of this discussion, which I think is completely unhelpful. If we're going to know more about slavery, then we should know so academically and through knowledge. But the idea that you know more as a Black person in 2024, a highly privileged young person at Oxford or Cambridge, and you've had the same experience as your ancestors who went through the hell of those times, I think is just insulting. It just reduces us to our skin colour and our ethnicity. Very unhelpful.
It's not suggesting for 1 minute that a contemporary Black person can immediately know what the experience of slavery is, but just that they feel the echo of history more deeply. A bit like, as a woman, I might have a better understanding of what it was like to miscarry and hemorrhage in medieval times than a man.